In the dust-choked town of Redemption, Gulch, a wedding dress was meant to be a woman's armor. But for Josephine Miller it became a shroud of public shame. Left at the altar, her dreams shattered. Before the entire town, she was a ghost with nowhere to haunt. That is until a man stepped from the shadows. He wasn't a savior. He was a rancher with cold eyes and an even colder proposition. Cole Forrester, a man who commanded the largest spread of land in the territory, made her an offer that was both an insult and a lifeline. This isn't just a tale of a jilted bride. It's the story of a desperate bargain struck in the dirt, a contract that would either build a dynasty or burn them both to the ground. The silence in Redemption Gulch's solitary church was a physical thing. It pressed in on the ears heavy and suffocating, thicker than the summer heat that warped the air outside. It was the kind of silence that follows a gunshot, a moment of profound, irreversible change. Josephine Miller stood at the altar, a statue carved from heartbreak, the white lace of her wedding gown, a cruel mockery of the purity and hope she'd felt just 10 minutes prior. Her intended Mr. Franklin Monroe, the town's promising young banker, had cleared his throat, his face the color of spoiled milk. He had looked not at her, but at the feet of the stern-faced reverend, and uttered the words that had sundered her world. "I cannot," he'd stammered, his voice thin and reedy. I have been misled. Her standing, it is not suitable. The union cannot proceed." A collective gasp had rippled through the pews. Not suitable. The words were a brand searing into her reputation in front of every soul in Redemption Gulch. The Websters from the Mercantile, the gruff blacksmith Mr. O'Connell, even the saloon girls who'd paused their morning duties to peek through the church doors. They all heard it. They all saw her, the orphan from the East, who had travelled 1,000 miles with a small dowry and a heart full of carefully tended dreams, publicly and completely undone. Franklin wouldn't meet her gaze. He scurried down the side aisle, his mother, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, sweeping him away, as if rescuing him from a contagion. And Josephine was left to stand in the wreckage. The hopeful scent of the wildflowers clutched in her hands turned funereal. Her veil felt like a spider's web trapping her in this perfect, horrifying moment. Reverend Michael, a kind man with weary eyes, gently touched her arm. "Josephine, my child." She couldn't hear him. The roaring in her ears was the sound of her future collapsing. She had sold her late mother's last remaining jewelry to afford the train ticket. She had given the boarding house notice. Her small trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, was already at the train station, ready to be moved to the new little house Franklin had promised. She had no family to run to, no home to retreat to. Franklin's declaration hadn't just jilted her. It had rendered her destitute and homeless in a single brutal breath. Somehow she found the strength to move. Her feet, numb and distant, carried her down the aisle past the blurred faces of pity and morbid curiosity. The white dress trailed behind her like a ghost. Outside, the Texas sun was a physical blow. The dust of the main street swirled around her pristine hem, soiling it instantly. It felt fitting. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked, a spectacle of sorrow. She passed the bank where Franklin worked its windows, glinting like smug eyes. She passed the Mercantile where she could feel Mrs. Webster's stare boring into her back. She ended up standing before the sheriff's office, not because she needed the law, but because it was the one place she felt too numb to be judged. "Miss Miller." The voice was low and steady, cutting through her daze. It came from the shadows of the covered boardwalk. She turned to see a man leaning against a support beam, arms crossed over a broad chest. He was tall, dressed not in a suit but in dusty practical rancher's clothes, worn leather chaps, a plain blue shirt, and a hat that shadowed his features. She recognized him as everyone in the territory did. Cole Forrester, owner of the Triple F Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that dwarfed every other holding for 100 miles. He was a man spoken of in whispers, powerful, solitary, and intensely private. She had only ever seen him from a distance, a formidable figure on a powerful horse, a king surveying his domain. Up close, his presence was even more intimidating. He pushed his hat back slightly, revealing a face that was all harsh angles and sun-weathered skin. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no pity. They held an unnerving, calculated intensity. "Mr. Forrester," she managed her voice, a dry rasp. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I was in the church, at the back." The shame washed over her again, hot and fresh. Of course, the whole world had been his audience. He straightened up, taking a step closer. He smelled of leather dust and something clean, like the open prairie after a rain. "Monroe is a fool and a coward, but his cowardice has created an opportunity." Josephine stared at him, bewildered. "An opportunity? I have a problem, Miss Miller," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And it seems to me so do you. Your problem is immediate. You have no money, no home, and in about 5 minutes, every busybody in this town is going to be dissecting your character like a fresh kill." His bluntness was a slap, but it was also strangely grounding. He wasn't offering useless condolences. He was stating facts. "My problem," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "is one of time. My father's will is particular. To inherit the Triple F in its entirety, I must be married by my 30th birthday. That day is 1 month from now." Josephine could only blink. "What did this have to do with her? I have no interest in courtship," he stated flatly. "It's an inefficient and often dishonest business. I require a wife, a signature on a document, a woman to reside under my roof to satisfy the terms of the law." He paused, his eyes sweeping over her from her disheveled hair to the dusty hem of her wedding gown. It wasn't a look of desire. It was an appraisal, like a rancher assessing livestock. "And you, Miss Miller," he finished, his voice dropping slightly, "you need a home." The world tilted on its axis. The heat, the dust, the shame, it all faded away, replaced by the sheer audacity of his words. He wasn't courting her. He wasn't wooing her. He was making a business proposition. You're proposing—" the word sounded absurd on her lips. "I am proposing a solution." He corrected his tone, devoid of any romance. "A transaction. You will become Mrs. Forrester. You will have a roof over your head, food on your table, and the protection of my name, a name no one in this territory dares slander. You will want for nothing materially. In return, you will live at my ranch, perform the duties of a wife in public when necessary, and allow me to secure my birthright." He saw the confusion and horror warring on her face, and pressed on, ruthlessly practical. "You can stand here and let this town swallow you whole, or you can get on my wagon. I need a woman. You, Miss Miller, need a home. It's as simple and as complicated as that. What's your answer?" He stood there, a bulwark against the tide of her despair, offering not a hand to hold, but a contract to sign. In the ruins of her life, this strange, cold man was offering to build her a shelter. It would be a prison, perhaps, a gilded cage, but it was also the only lifeline in sight. The choice was impossible, and yet she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she had no choice at all. Josephine's answer was not a word, but a slow, defeated nod. It was the assent of a drowning woman agreeing to grab a thorny branch. It would cut her, but it would keep her head above water. A flicker of something not satisfaction, but perhaps the quiet resolution of a problem solved passed through Cole Forrester's eyes. "Good," he said, his tone as brisk as before. "There's no sense in delaying. The justice of the peace, Judge Peterson, owes me a favor. We'll have it done before sunset." The world spun into a blur of numb obedience. Cole led her not to a fine carriage, but to a sturdy, mud-spattered buckboard wagon hitched outside the saloon. He didn't offer a hand to help her up, and she didn't expect one. She clambered onto the hard wooden seat, her pristine wedding dress looking utterly ridiculous against the wagon's rough-hewn utility. The gossamer veil, which she hadn't had the presence of mind to remove, snagged on a splinter and tore. She pulled it free with a sharp tug, the sound of ripping fabric, a final pathetic coda to her wedding day. The ride to Judge Peterson's office was short and silent. Heads turned as they passed, eyes widened, whispers followed them like a swarm of locusts. The jilted bride, not an hour after her humiliation, riding with the territory's most powerful and reclusive rancher. The story was already writing itself in the town's collective imagination, and Josephine knew none of it would be kind to her. Judge Peterson was a harried man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked from Cole's thunderous expression to Josephine's ghost-white face, and wisely asked no questions. The ceremony was a barren affair, stripped of all sentiment. The words that should have been spoken with love and hope were recited in a monotone, a legal script meant to bind them, not in spirit, but in law. When Cole slid a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger, it felt cold and heavy, a manacle. There was no kiss, just a curt nod from the judge and the scratching of a pen on a certificate. She was now Mrs. Josephine Forrester. The name felt alien, a costume she was forced to wear. The journey to the Triple F ranch began as dusk bled purple and orange across the vast Texas sky. They left the small, suffocating confines of Redemption Gulch behind the wagon wheels, grinding a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The landscape opened up, becoming a sprawling canvas of mesas, scrub brush, and endless sky. It was beautiful in a stark, intimidating way. Cole spoke only once in the first hour. The Triple F was my grandfather's, then my father's. Now it's mine. The land is honest. It gives back what you put into it. People are rarely so straightforward. It wasn't a conversation starter. It was a declaration of his values. Land over people. As they drew closer, the ranch itself began to emerge from the twilight. It wasn't a single house, but a small settlement. A massive two-story ranch house, built of dark timber and riverstone, stood as the centerpiece, flanked by a long bunkhouse, a blacksmith's forge, several barns, and a web of corrals. It was less a home and more a fortress, the headquarters of an empire. This was her new home. Barbed wire fences, glinting in the last light, stretched out as far as the eye could see. She was inside Cole Forrester's domain, now his barbed wire palace. A man emerged from the largest barn as they pulled up. He was older, with a leathery face and a slight limp, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. "Boss," he said, his gaze flicking curiously to Josephine. Gus Cole acknowledged with a nod. "This is Miss Miller, my wife." The foreman, Gus, did a remarkable job of schooling his features into a neutral mask, but his eyes widened for a fraction of a second. "Mum," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to the Triple F." As Cole helped unload her single pathetic trunk, a woman appeared on the porch of the main house. She was tall and severe, her hair pulled back in a bun, so tight it seemed to tug at the corners of her eyes. She wiped her hands on a stark white apron, her expression one of permanent disapproval. Mrs. Gable Cole said, "This is my wife, Josephine. She'll be the mistress of the house. See that a room is prepared for her. The one at the east end of the hall." Mrs. Gable's thin lips tightened. "The east room. But, sir, your room is in the west wing." I'm aware of where my room is." Cole said, his voice flat and final, leaving no room for argument. The message was clear, delivered for the benefit of both the housekeeper and Josephine. "This is a sham. We will not be sharing a bed." The housekeeper's gaze fell upon Josephine, and it was filled with an icy suspicion. She saw not a new bride, but an interloper, a schemer who had somehow ensnared her master. In Mrs. Gable, Josephine knew she had not found an ally, but a warden. Later, standing alone in her assigned room, Josephine looked around. It was a beautiful chamber, far grander than any she had ever occupied. A large four-poster bed, a polished mahogany wardrobe, a small writing desk, and a window that looked out onto the endless star-dusted prairie. It was a luxurious prison cell. Her wedding dress lay in a heap on the floor, where she'd let it fall, a puddle of ruined dreams. She touched the cold gold band on her finger. A knock came at the door. It was Cole. He didn't enter, just stood in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. "Mrs. Gable will bring you a supper tray," he said. "The rules of our arrangement are simple. In public, in town, or in front of any visitors, you are my wife. Here on the ranch, amongst the staff, we are landlord and tenant. You will have your privacy, and I will have mine. Is that understood?" "Yes," she whispered. "Good." He paused, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. He seemed about to say something else, but then he simply turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the long, silent hall of the West Wing, leaving her alone in the east. She was Mrs. Forrester, mistress of a barbed wire palace wife to a stranger, and more alone than she had ever been in her life. The first weeks at the Triple F were a study in silent coexistence. Josephine and Cole moved through the massive house like ghosts in separate orbits. They ate their meals at opposite ends of a long dining table, the cavernous space between them filled only with the clinking of silverware and the judgmental presence of Mrs. Gable, who served them with a tightly coiled disapproval. Cole was gone before sunrise and returned after sunset, smelling of dust and horse and hard labor. He was consumed by the ranch, a man whose entire being was tied to the rhythm of the land. Josephine, meanwhile, was adrift. Mrs. Gable ran the house with iron-fisted efficiency, leaving Josephine with no domestic duties, and making it clear her input was neither needed nor wanted. The ranch hands were polite but distant, viewing her as the boss's strange, sudden wife, an object of curiosity, not conversation. Only Gus the foreman would offer a respectful "Ma'am" and a brief weather-related comment if their paths crossed. Boredom and isolation became her constant companions. She spent her days reading the few books in the house's small library, or walking the perimeter near the main house, always conscious of the invisible boundary she was not to cross. This wasn't a life. It was a beautifully furnished waiting room. One evening, driven by a desperate need for purpose, she strayed from her usual path and entered the one room she'd been tacitly avoiding Cole's office. It was a purely masculine space, smelling of old paper leather and faint cigar smoke. A large oak desk was buried under a chaotic mountain of papers, receipts, cattle tallies, letters, and account ledgers. Cole was a master of cattle and land, but he was clearly no bookkeeper. An idea, small and timid at first, began to form. At the orphanage where she grew up, she had been tasked with helping the headmistress with the accounts. She was quick with numbers, her mind, sharp and orderly. It was a skill she had never considered a virtue until this very moment. Hesitantly, she picked up a ledger. The entries were haphazard, the columns barely balanced. She saw receipts for grain wire and supplies stuffed into drawers unrecorded. Forgetting her fear of overstepping, she sat down at the desk, lit a lamp, and began to work. She sorted, she tallied, she cross-referenced. She created new pages, her neat, elegant script, a stark contrast to Cole's impatient scrawl. She worked for hours, losing all track of time, the focused task, a balm to her restless soul. For the first time since her arrival, she felt useful. She didn't hear him enter. "What are you doing?" The voice, low and sharp, made her jump. Cole stood in the doorway, his shadow long in the lamplight. His face was a thundercloud of suspicion. I'm sorry," she stammered, standing up so quickly she knocked over a stack of papers. "I shouldn't have come in here. It's just—" They were a mess. He walked to the desk, his eyes scanning her work. He picked up a page she had just completed, where she'd collated a month's worth of supply costs and tallied them against the income from a recent cattle sale. He saw how she had noted a discrepancy, a supplier in San Antonio charging them 15% more for barbed wire than a rival company just a town away. He was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. Josephine braced herself for a reprimand for being told to return to her room and her uselessness. "You found this?" he finally asked, tapping the note about the supplier. "Yes. According to their own price list from 2 months ago, the cost has inflated without reason. It's a small amount on one order, but over a year, it's hundreds of dollars." Cole looked from the ledger to her, and for the first time she saw something other than cold indifference in his eyes. It was a flicker of surprise, of reluctant respect. "The orphanage," she explained quietly. "I kept the books." He put the paper down. "Keep going," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Do all of them." And with that, he turned and left, leaving her standing in the warm glow of the lamp, a strange sense of victory blooming in her chest. Their dynamic began to shift. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change. He started leaving the ledgers on the dining table for her. Sometimes late at night, he would come into the office while she worked, not to hover, but to sit in the large leather chair by the fire, cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of tack. They wouldn't speak much, but the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was a shared space, a comfortable quiet between two people engaged in a common purpose. The real turning point came a week later. A blistering heat wave had settled over the territory, sucking the moisture from the earth. The creek that watered Cole's prime grazing pasture had slowed to a muddy trickle. "It's Higgins, Gus," said one morning, his face grim. "Rode up to the North Pass. He's dammed the stream, diverting the water to his own land." Bartholomew Bart Higgins was their neighbor to the north, a ruthless man known for his greed. He and Cole's father had been bitter rivals, and Higgins had been trying to choke the Triple F for years. "That water source is on my land." "He has no right!" Cole snarled, his hands clenching into fists. "We'll ride out, tear it down. He's got a dozen men up there with rifles," Boss Gus warned. "He's daring you to a fight. If blood is spilled, he'll get the law on his side, claim you're the aggressor." Cole was trapped. To do nothing meant his prize herd would sicken and die. To attack meant walking into Higgins's trap. He paced the porch like a caged panther. Josephine, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "There's another way," she said softly. Both men turned to look at her. "The original land survey," she said, her mind racing back to the documents she had seen in the office. "I saw it when I was organizing your father's papers. The deed from the state specifies the water rights. It's a federal document. Higgins can have all the hired guns he wants, but he can't fight the United States government." Cole stopped pacing. "The survey maps. I haven't seen them in years. They're in the bottom drawer of the desk in a leather tube," she said immediately. "Along with the grant, signed by Governor Roberts himself." A slow grin spread across Gus's weathered face. Cole stared at Josephine, a new and powerful understanding dawning in his eyes. She wasn't just a signature on a page or a clever bookkeeper. She had a mind for strategy, a memory for detail that he lacked. She had seen the solution not in fists and bullets, but in ink and law. Gus Cole ordered his voice alive with a new energy. Ride to Redemption Gulch. Get Sheriff Brody. Tell him to meet me at the pass, and tell him I'm bringing proof that Higgins is committing a federal crime. As Gus hurried to saddle his horse, Cole turned back to Josephine. He stood before her, closer than he ever had willingly. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a dam breaking. It was an admission of need that had nothing to do with his father's will. That afternoon, she watched from her window as Cole rode out, sword, not with a band of armed ranch hands, but with the sheriff by his side and the leather tube containing the deeds strapped to his saddle. He was going to fight for his water, not with a gun, but with a document she had found. He was fighting with her weapon, and as she watched him disappear over the rise, she realized with a jolt that her heart was pounding, not with fear for a stranger, but with hope for her husband. The victory was swift and decisive. Faced with Sheriff Brody, a federal land grant, and the threat of a U.S., Marshal Bart Higgins's men had sullenly dismantled their illegal dam. Cole returned to the Triple F that evening, tired but triumphant. The water was flowing again. He had won the battle without firing a shot, a fact that seemed to earn him more respect among his men than a bloody skirmish ever could have. That night, for the first time, he didn't just leave the ledgers for Josephine. He sat down at the desk opposite her, rolling up his sleeves. "Show me," he said. "Show me what you do." And so she did. She walked him through her system, explaining how she tracked expenditures and profits. He in turn explained the complexities of the cattle business, the timing of the drives, the cost of winter, feed the brutal calculus of profit and loss. For hours they talked, their heads bent together over the papers in the warm pool of lamplight. The vast, lonely house seemed to shrink around them, the office becoming an island of shared purpose. He was no longer just her landlord, and she was no longer just his tenant. They were partners. In this newfound partnership, a dangerous seed of curiosity began to sprout in Josephine's mind. If Bart Higgins was brazen enough to steal their water, what else was he capable of? And why did the name of her former fiancé, Franklin Monroe, keep nagging at the back of her thoughts? Redemption Gulch was a small town. Men like Higgins and men like Monroe, the ambitious banker, surely moved in the same circles. The deadline for the Will Cole's 30th birthday was now less than 2 weeks away. The ranch felt secure, their partnership solidified, but the foundation of their marriage, the humiliating event in the church, remained a raw, unanswered question. She needed to know the truth, not just for her own peace of mind, but because she was beginning to feel a fierce, protective loyalty to the Triple F and the man who had given her a home. An instinct told her the two threads had jilting, and the threats to the ranch were entangled. "I need to go to town," she announced to Cole one morning. He looked up from his coffee, surprised. She rarely left the ranch. "What for? Supplies?" She lied, then immediately felt foolish for it. She decided on a portion of the truth, and to settle an old account. "I need to speak with Franklin Monroe." A muscle tightened in Cole's jaw. His eyes, which had softened toward her over the past weeks, grew guarded again. "Monroe is a snake. There's no point in stirring that nest. A snake only bites when it's threatened." She countered, her voice steady. "I am no longer a threat to him. I am Mrs. Cole Forrester." He may be more inclined to be honest with a woman who can no longer be ruined. He studied her for a long moment, seeing the determination in her eyes. It was the same determination that had untangled his finances and saved his pasture. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "Gus will ride with you." Redemption. Gulch felt different this time. Riding into town on a fine mare from Cole's stable with the formidable Gus trotting beside her, she was not the pitiable jilted bride. Her simple but well-made dress, courtesy of the funds Cole had insisted she take for a new wardrobe, and the confidence in her posture earned through weeks of meaningful work, made heads turn for an entirely different reason. They saw the mistress of the Triple F. She found Franklin at the bank, looking paler and more anxious than ever. When he saw her, he nearly dropped the stack of documents in his hands. "Josephine, Mrs. Forrester." He corrected himself, stumbling over the name. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice cool and even. She felt no heartbreak, only a cold resolve. "I have no wish to cause a scene. I have one question for you, and I expect an honest answer. Why did you do it?" He licked his lips, his eyes darting around the bank. "I told you. You're standing." "Do not lie to me." "Franklin," she cut him off, her voice low and sharp. "I know you better than that. You are weak and you are easily frightened, but you are not needlessly cruel." "Someone forced your hand. Was it Bart Higgins?" The mention of the name struck him like a physical blow. The color drained completely from his face. He grabbed her arm, his hand trembling, and pulled her into a small private office. "How do you know?" he hissed, his composure crumbling. "So it's true." Franklin sank into a chair, his face in his hands. The confession came tumbling out, a pathetic torrent of fear and regret. He had incurred massive gambling debts to a syndicate in San Antonio, debts he couldn't pay. Bart Higgins, who had connections to the syndicate, found out. He offered Monroe a deal. He didn't want money, Franklin whispered, his voice cracking. He knew Cole Forrester needed a respectable wife to secure his inheritance. Higgins has wanted the Forrester land for a generation. He saw a chance to block Cole. Josephine felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "What did he have you do?" "Higgins knew you were arriving, that you were a woman of good character, an orphan with no powerful family to protect her. A perfect match for a man like Cole, who wouldn't want complicated in-laws," Franklin explained. "Higgins ordered me to court you to make a public spectacle of it, to set a wedding date." The pieces clicked into place, each one more horrifying than the last. "And then, he told you to jilt me. At the altar. In the most humiliating way possible." Franklin nodded, unable to meet her gaze. He dictated the words himself. "Not suitable. He wanted to ruin your reputation so thoroughly that no man of standing, especially Cole Forrester, would consider you. He wanted you stranded and shamed. He figured it would take Cole months to find another suitable candidate, and by then the deadline would have passed. The sheer diabolical cruelty of the plan took her breath away. Higgins hadn't just tried to steal water. He had used her life, her heart, and her hopes as a pawn in his chess game against Cole. He had orchestrated her entire humiliation, gambling that it would be the key to destroying the Triple F. A cold, hard anger, unlike anything she had ever felt, settled in her heart. This was no longer about her shame. This was about justice. Higgins had not just wronged her and Cole. He had declared war on them. She stood up, her back ramrod straight. "Thank you, Franklin. You've been very helpful." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to go home," she said, her voice like ice. "And I am going to tell my husband that his enemy has made a very grave mistake. He didn't just try to steal his land. He came after his wife." As she walked out of the bank and into the bright Texas sun, she was no longer Josephine Miller, the rejected bride. She was Josephine Forrester, and she was on a warpath. The journey back to the Triple F was a silent, furious storm. The rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves against the sun-baked earth matched the frantic pounding in Josephine's chest. Gus, ever perceptive, sensed the tempest brewing within her. He cast worried glances at her face, a marble mask of controlled rage, and urged his horse to a faster pace, understanding without being told that this was not a matter that could wait. The dust they kicked up was a pale, impotent cloud compared to the whirlwind of betrayal and fury consuming her thoughts. Every detail of Franklin's confession replayed in her mind, each word a fresh lash. It wasn't just that Higgins had plotted against Cole. It was the sheer intimate cruelty of his method. He had peered into her life, assessed her vulnerabilities, her orphan status, her lack of protection, her earnest hope, and had woven them into a weapon. Her dreams of a small, happy home with Franklin had been a charade. Her journey west a fool's errand. Her public humiliation a meticulously staged piece of theater for an audience of one Cole Forrester. Higgins had tried to turn her very existence into a poison meant to cripple his rival. The thought sent a tremor of ice-cold anger through her so profound it burned away any remaining trace of shame. They thundered into the ranch yard, scattering chickens and drawing the curious eyes of a half-dozen ranch hands. Josephine didn't wait for Gus to help her dismount. She slid from the saddle before the mare had even come to a full stop, her skirts flying. Her eyes scanned the compound landing on Cole's tall frame near the branding corrals. The air was thick with the smell of scorched hair and hide the bellowing of calves and the shouts of men at work. It was the heart of his world, and she strode into it like a Valkyrie. "Cole." Her voice cut through the clamor, sharp and clear and ringing with an authority that stunned the nearest cowboys into silence. They stopped their work, their branding irons held aloft, and stared at the approaching storm that was their boss's wife. Cole's head snapped up. He saw her face, the wild energy in her eyes, and knew instantly that this was far more than a simple trip for supplies. He handed the rope he was holding to a bewildered hand and strode to meet her, his own features tightening with concern. He met her halfway between the house and the fire. "Josephine, what is it?" "What did that coward Monroe say?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She didn't waste a moment. Standing there in the dust, surrounded by the sights and sounds of his empire, she laid out the entire venomous conspiracy. In short, clipped sentences that vibrated with suppressed fury, she detailed Franklin's gambling debts, Higgins's insidious offer, and the calculated plan to weaponize her reputation. "He never wanted to marry me," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but her gaze unwavering. Higgins directed the entire courtship. He chose the church. He chose the date. He even wrote the words Franklin used to jilt me. She took a ragged breath, the memory still raw. Not suitable. He wanted me to be so thoroughly shamed that I would be untouchable, a pariah. He gambled that you would never consider a ruined woman, that you'd run out of time to find a respectable wife. As she spoke, a terrifying transformation took place in Cole's face. The stoic calm he wore like armor cracked and fell away, revealing something primal and dangerous beneath. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, now held crackling bolts of lightning. This was no longer a squabble over a water source or a generational grudge over fence lines. This was an invasion. Bart Higgins had crept into the most personal corners of his life, had taken this woman, this resilient, intelligent woman, who now bore his name, and had tried to break her for his own gain. The offense was so profound, so intimate, it bypassed all logic and settled deep in his bones. He orchestrated my public ruin. Josephine finished her voice, dropping to a near whisper, heavy with the weight of the revelation, to get to your ranch. Cole's hand shot out, not in anger, but with a startling, possessive gentleness. His calloused fingers wrapped around her arm, his touch a steady grounding anchor in her maelstrom of emotion. He drew her a half-step closer, his gaze burning with an intensity that had nothing to do with land. "He didn't ruin you, Josephine," he said, his voice a low, gravelly promise that vibrated through her. "He made you my wife." The words hung in the air between them, a vow more powerful than any spoken before a judge. In that single electric moment, the last pretense of their arrangement was incinerated. They were no longer landlord and tenant, no longer partners in commerce. They were allies forged in the fire of a common enemy's hate. The sham marriage, a desperate contract scribbled in the shadow of her disgrace, had been hammered into a true and formidable alliance. The deadline for the will was now only 3 days away. The ranch's lawyer, Mr. Peterson, was already on his way from Austin to verify that the conditions had been met. Higgins's primary plan had failed. Spectacularly, Cole had found a wife in the very woman Higgins had tried to discard. But neither of them was naive enough to believe it was over. A cornered animal is the most dangerous, and Bart Higgins was a man who would never accept defeat. He would have one last card to play. That evening, the office was no longer just Cole's space. It was their war room. A lamp cast a warm, golden circle on the desk, where they sat not opposite each other, but side by side, studying the legal papers as a united front. "He'll try to prove the marriage is a fraud," Cole said, his voice grim as he stared unseeing at his father's will. "He'll attack its legitimacy. He'll argue it's a business transaction, nothing more. He'll claim we don't live as man and wife." Josephine's heart sank as her mind immediately landed on the one person whose testimony could give that claim a devastating ring of truth. Mrs. Gable, she breathed. The housekeeper's icy disapproval had been a constant since her arrival. Her unwavering loyalty was to the memory of the late Mr. Forrester and the unblemished honor of his name. In Mrs. Gable's eyes, Josephine was a schemer, an opportunist who had trapped her master in a marriage of convenience. Higgins, with his insidious cunning, would surely see her as the key to undoing them. He would approach her preying on her suspicions and her rigid sense of propriety. "He will offer her whatever she wants to testify against us." Josephine said the thought, making her feel cold. Cole leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "We can't dismiss her. Firing the most loyal servant on the ranch a day before the lawyer arrives would be an admission of guilt. No, she has to stay. Then what do we do? How can we trust her? She looks at me as if I'm a rattlesnake she found curled up on your pillow." Cole was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "My father trusted her completely," he said, finally, his voice softer. "When I was 10, a plague hit the herd. We nearly lost everything. Men deserted, thinking the ranch was finished. But Mrs. Gable stayed. She nursed my mother who had fallen ill with fever, and she worked in the kitchen day and night to feed the few hands who remained. She serves the ranch, Josephine. Not just me, not just my father's memory, but the Triple F itself. Its future. Her hardness comes from loyalty. She may be suspicious of you, but she is not a dishonest woman." He leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers. "We can't convince her with words. We have to let her see the truth. Their strategy was set. It was a gamble, a breathtaking leap of faith. They would not perform for Mrs. Gable. They would simply stop hiding the truth from her. In the final days before the lawyer's arrival, they let the genuine, unforced bond that had grown between them come into the light. The careful distance they had maintained for weeks dissolved. He sought her opinion on which bull to sell. She asked for his help mending a torn book from the library. The east and west wings of the house no longer felt like separate countries, with a demilitarized zone in the hallway. One afternoon, he took her to his father's favorite lookout, a high, wind-swept mesa that offered a panoramic view of the entire Triple F domain. The land rolled out below them in waves of green and gold. My father used to say that from here you couldn't see the beginning or the end of it. Cole said, his voice filled with a rare, quiet reverence. He said it reminded him that we don't own the land. We just hold it in trust for a while. He spoke of his lonely childhood, of a father who was more of a king than a parent, and of his deep, abiding love for the very soil beneath their feet. Listening to him, Josephine understood that the ranch was the core of his soul. Another evening, as she sat reading by the fire, he quietly entered and settled into the large leather chair opposite her, simply watching. Feeling his gaze, she looked up. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover, a book of poems. At his request, she began to read aloud, her voice, a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet room. Mrs. Gable, passing by the open doorway with a stack of linens, paused for a fraction of a second, her expression unreadable, before continuing on her way. They were not performing. They were simply being, and their being together was becoming more natural than their being apart. The day of the lawyer's arrival dawned bright and tense. Mr. Peterson was a portly, serious man from Austin, whose spectacles seemed to magnify the gravity of his purpose. He sat in the office, Cole's father's will spread before him like a sacred text. "Everything seems to be perfectly in order," Cole the lawyer announced, nodding with satisfaction. "The marriage certificate is legally filed and binding. The deadline of your 30th birthday is met. There is, however," he cleared his throat uncomfortably, "one small unofficial inquiry I have been asked to make." As if summoned by the words, the office door swung open. Sheriff Brody stood there, his face impassive, and behind him, radiating a smug, predatory confidence, was Bart Higgins, afternoon forester. Peterson Higgins sneered, striding into the room as if he owned it, just here as a concerned citizen, and a potential beneficiary should this whole charade fall apart. A man who marries a woman on the very day she was publicly disgraced. It stinks to high heaven. It smells of desperation, of a sordid business deal, not a holy union. I contend this marriage is a sham, a fraud, perpetrated solely to subvert the dying wishes of your esteemed father. Mr. Peterson paled slightly. "Mr. Higgins has filed a formal last-minute challenge to the execution of the will," he explained, shuffling his papers. "He claims to have a witness who will testify to the true nature of your living arrangements." Cole's jaw was a granite ridge, but his eyes found Josephine's across the room. She met his gaze and gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. Let him play his final wretched card. "Call your witness, Sheriff Brody," said his voice, flat and bored, as if he'd seen this kind of petty drama 100 times. Higgins's lips twisted into a triumphant smirk. "I call Mrs. Gable." A heavy silence fell over the room. Mrs. Gable entered her spine, as rigid as a fence post, her face a stony mask. She did not look at Cole, and she pointedly refused to look at Josephine. She stood before the lawyer's desk, a figure of uncompromising, stern propriety, and Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. Their entire future rested on this woman's words. Mrs. Gable Higgins began, his voice oozing a false, syrupy sympathy that made Josephine's skin crawl. "You have served the Forrester family loyally for 3 decades. You more than anyone know the honor and tradition of this great house. Tell us, please. Tell Mr. Peterson the truth. Do Mr. and Mrs. Forrester share a life? Do they share a home, or do they in fact occupy separate wings of this house, living as strangers under one roof?" Mrs. Gable stood motionless for a long, agonizing moment. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded like hammer blows. She slowly raised her head, her gaze sweeping over the room. She looked at Cole, her master. She looked at Josephine the interloper. Her eyes, which for weeks had held only cold judgment, lingered. And in their depths, Josephine saw the flicker she had prayed for. Not pity, not warmth, but something far more powerful: respect. Finally, the housekeeper turned her unwavering gaze upon Bart Higgins. When she spoke, her voice was not the quiet tone of a servant, but the clear, ringing pronouncement of a matriarch defending her own. "I have seen Mr. Forrester bring his bride to this house as a frightened, shamed girl." She began her words deliberate and strong. "I have watched that same girl take the chaos of this ranch's accounts, a mess that has plagued this house for years, and turn it into a model of order and profit. I have seen her use her mind to find a solution to save this ranch's herd from thirst, when all the men could think of was brute force and bloodshed." She took a sharp breath, her eyes flashing. "I have seen my master, a man who has been walled off in his own grief since his father's passing, begin to live again. I have heard them in this very office, late into the night, not whispering sweet nothings, but debating the price of grain and the future of the herd, their voices filled with mutual respect. I have heard her read to him by the fire. I have seen him look at her as if she holds the setting sun in her hands." She straightened to her full height, a figure of undeniable moral authority. "It is true they occupy separate bedrooms. This house is large enough for 12 families. But a marriage is not a deed to a room. It is a partnership. It is defined by loyalty, by shared purpose, and by the courage to face a common enemy. What I have witnessed in this house these past weeks is more of a true and honest marriage than most couples find in a lifetime of sharing a bed." Her gaze narrowed, becoming 2 chips of ice as she pinned Higgins to the wall with her contempt. "And it is certainly more honorable than the actions of a greedy vulture who would manipulate and destroy a young woman's heart simply to steal his neighbor's land." The condemnation was absolute. Higgins stood stunned into silence, his face mottling with shades of purple and red. A slow grin spread across Sheriff Brody's face. Mr. Peterson, the lawyer, beaming with relief and satisfaction, slammed his heavy briefcase shut with an air of resounding finality. "The challenge is baseless and dismissed," he declared loudly. "Congratulations, Cole. The Triple F Ranch is yours unequivocally and without question." Higgins sputtered a string of incoherent curses, catching in his throat, but the sheriff was already moving. He clapped a heavy hand on Higgins's shoulder, and with a quiet, "I think your business here is concluded," steered the defeated man out of the office and out of their lives. That evening, a profound peace settled over the Triple F. The threat was gone. The will was satisfied. The contract that had bound them together was fulfilled. They stood on the wide front porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the vast sky in brilliant hues of fire and gold. The land that had been the cause of so much strife now seemed to be breathing a sigh of relief alongside them. The legal reason for their union had dissolved into the twilight. They were free. Josephine turned to him, her heart a fragile, hopeful thing in her throat. "The will is satisfied," she said softly. "Our arrangement, it's complete." Cole turned to face her fully, the last light of day catching the sharp planes of his face. He reached out and took the hand that wore his simple, unadorned gold band, his thumb stroking the back of her fingers. "The arrangement is," he agreed, his voice deeper than usual, thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "But I find myself in a new predicament." "What's that?" she whispered, her breath catching. He looked down at her, and his stormy eyes were clear, washed clean by the trials they had endured. They were filled with a light she had only dreamed of seeing there, not possession, not gratitude, not even just respect. It was love, raw, powerful and undeniable. When I made my offer in town, I declared that I needed a woman, and you needed a home. He said, his voice a low, earnest rumble. I was wrong. I was a fool who only saw the shape of my problem. This ranch doesn't need a woman to satisfy a will. I need you, Josephine. I need your strength, and your mind, and your courage. I need the peace you bring to this house, and to me. He squeezed her hand, his gaze intense and pleading. I don't want to offer you a house anymore. I want to offer you a home, with me, in every sense of the word. Will you stay? Not as part of a bargain, not to fulfill a contract, but as my wife, my true wife. Tears hot and welcome welled in Josephine's eyes, blurring the image of his beloved face. She thought of the cold, shattered girl left standing at the altar, a ghost in a wedding dress. And she looked at the woman she was now strong, respected, and loved. She had been offered a loveless contract as a lifeline, and from its bitter terms she had cultivated a life, a partnership, and a love more real and enduring than any fairy tale promise. A radiant smile broke through her tears. Yes, Cole, she said, her voice full of a certainty that resonated deep in her soul. She stepped closer into the circle of his arms and laid her head against his chest. Yes, I'm already home. And so the rejected bride and the rich cowboy, two lonely souls brought together by a cruel plot and a cold contract, found their truth not in a church vow, but in the shared dust of a cattle drive, the ink of a ledger, and the quiet understanding forged in a common fight. Theirs is a story that reminds us that home isn't always a place you are given, but a fortress you build with someone you trust. It proves that love doesn't always start with a spark. Sometimes it's a slow-burning fire that grows in the shelter of a shared life, powerful enough to warm the coldest corners of the heart. If this story of resilience, revenge, and reluctant love in the Old West stirred your spirit, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates a tale where the heart proves mightier than any contract. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas and epic stories from the untamed frontier. We'll see you in the next one.